Welcome to the Daily Blog Live interview with the new leader of the Labour Party, David Cunliffe. Welcome, David, and congratulations on your win.
Oh, thank you very much, Bomber. Great to be here, and you're back up with Selwyn. Particular shout out to all of the Daily Blog viewers, readers, and supporters. It's been a great debate on the blog over the last few weeks, and I know it will continue because now we've got to deliver, and we will. I'm afraid I've just lost sound, guys.
Okay, can you still hear me, David?
I can hear you.
Okay, well, that's good. David, we'll go straight to some questions here.
Sure.
Basically, we've seen the national-led government, like particularly today, starting to position some positive kind of news around the economy, and even citing the OECD reports, etc., relating to where New Zealand is tracking. How do you actually read that? But more importantly too, it's a double banger question here, there are recommendations, for example, in the OECD reports of June that suggest that New Zealand needs significant structural reform. How do you read where the national-led government is tracking on this, and also whether or not we should be following the OECD?
Well, I've had my head buried in a caucus reshuffle today rather than reading the detail of the GDP figures. I understand they're up very marginally, but I think it's instructive that when GDP is almost static, the government crows that it's a huge victory, and I think that just shows how low their expectations are, because they're stuck in a neoliberal framework that seems to have ignored the fact that the global financial crisis has arrived. So and our challenge is to describe what the next phase looks like for Social Democrats, a program which will be job-rich, value-rich, a foundation for a new social equity, but one which is also pragmatically achievable and fiscally affordable.
Sure.
So I think we can do all of those things, but in doing so, if we're successful, I think we'll end up describing a brand new form of community-based social democracy, which will be, I hope, amongst the early versions of that description internationally, just as we were, sadly, during the Rogernomics era.
Yeah, so social democratic based economy. Are you talking to relating to using the OECD recommendations? For example, it's saying capital gains tax. You've already said you would do that. You're talking about very much a hands-on type of relationship here. If we're talking like New Zealand's economy in 4 years' time, are we very much going to be export-led? And if so, what does that mean as far as the first year of the first term of a Labour-led government?
Let's take three areas that you've helpfully touched on. The first being tax policy, the second being the export orientation, and the third, how do we get more job-rich? In terms of, sorry, now I've lost my train of thought. The first of those was.
Yeah, if we look at the social democracy-styled economy, if we're reverting back to that, basically, I guess I'm getting down to...
capital gains tax, sorry.
Capital gains tax and OECD.
Talking about tax. Okay, the problem we've got is twofold. Firstly, we only tax income, we don't tax capital. We're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't bother. And it ignores the fact that since World War II, just so much of the value that's been accrued has gone to the top few percent of wealth holders, including in New Zealand. And if you and I get taxed on every dollar of our salary or our wages, and if there are too many people out in New Zealand barely scraping together a living, whether that is on low incomes or part-time work or a benefit, how come it's okay that people who have massive property portfolios don't pay a cent on capital gain, or people who speculate on share trades or anything else, if they make capital gain, it's tax-free? Well, that's ridiculous. And we're only one of the few countries in the world that lets people away with it. So that's one problem. Second problem is a lot of the wealthy don't even pay income tax. They structure it up in trusts and companies, and it's almost like some hairy-chested mark of achievement that they effectively defraud the tax system of paying their fair share. So we're coming after that. We're going to reform trust law. We're going to come down hard on tax evasion. and we're going to change the boundary line around avoidance. So the principle of it is everybody pays their fair share.
Sounds like a pretty a straightforward principle in many respects. I'll hand you over to Bomber Bradbury. He's got a couple of questions he's going to put to you as well.
Kia ora. My first question, David. New Zealand has one of the fastest rates of inequality in the OECD, and with 800,000 New Zealanders living in poverty, with Māori and Pacifica peoples most harshly hit, what direct action would Labour seek to alleviate that?
Okay, well look, carrying on from the tax theme, if we get a little more in the coffers, we get a little more to play with. I don't think, however, that our tax and benefit system is inexhaustible. And there's a whole bunch of literature around about building into the wage system better structures and processes so that we have more social equity. So stuff like industry standard agreements, which would put unions back at the heart of industrial relations. The idea that we would have a living wage and we would pilot that through the government sector. The fact that we would raise the minimum wage, the fact that we would protect vulnerable workers, and the fact that we would get better jobs is all part of a package that rather than redistributes, you might say pre-distributes by hardwiring in better levels of social equity right from the start. And we have to change the industrial relations framework to get there, and we will.
Bomber, have you got a supplementary question there for David?
Yes, climate change, of course, is going to hit those in poverty hardest. Without leadership on environmental standards, how do you manage their increased vulnerability?
Well, you have to have a climate change policy that believes it's real and it's a fact, as I keep saying, not a philosophy. It's just going to happen whether we like it or not. And of course it's human-induced. So that's going to have a number of effects on us. The first is that it's going to get a lot wetter on the west coast, it's going to get a lot drier on the east coast, we're going to suffer more droughts, more extreme weather events, we're going to get some sea level rise, we'll probably get environmental refugees, particularly from the low-lying atolls of the Pacific, and it may affect a lot of our markets as well, and could usher in a period of global instability. So all of that requires us to think ahead, better management systems for water resources, particularly on the east coast of both islands, a real determined push at harnessing our resources for building forest sinks, attaching a price to carbon, having an ETS that works, participating in the post-Kyoto treaty negotiations. That's all part of a decent response to climate change. Well, how does that tie back to the most vulnerable in our society? Well, we have to have an economy that is reasonably resilient to climate change. Otherwise, we will find we've got a much worse problem of unemployment and therefore poverty.
Bomber,
I'll come in here on some foreign policy questions, if you like, to David.
Please do.
It leads in.
You lead, because that's the way I can hear it. Go for it.
Yeah, sure. David, you mentioned in there, and this gels perfectly with the foreign policy kind of leads that we were wanting to bring in at this stage. You mentioned climate change refugee as almost a definition of what's going to come in the future. And I know at the United Nations level, they've had a lot of trouble pulling countries in on that to actually acknowledge and put into the legislation a definition of climate change refugee as a status, if you like. Do you see New Zealand leading the way on that particular type of definition and also initiative?
Absolutely. We've been, under the last Labour government, primary sponsors of a group called AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, which has been a key lobbyist within the UN system for climate change response. So Tuvalu, Kiribati and others have been right up the front, Tonga I think as well, in saying, hang on, our entire living space is going to disappear, will become arid because of climate change. So of course you know that refugee policy, asylum refugees, are folks who are under a severe threat of life-threatening consequences if they stay in their home countries. Well, you know, drowning is life-threatening, starving is life-threatening, so I can certainly see a link through from climate change response to asylum policy. Yes. And it's part of a bigger picture, isn't it? I mean, New Zealand should be, in my view, kind of like a Nordic of the South Pacific, a small, smart country that's prepared to lead in international human rights, and that's a contribution we can make.
What I'm picking up here, David, is quite a significant change, perhaps, than we've been tracking in the last, since 2008 in particular. I guess some would define our foreign policy as one where we're reconnecting to those old countries. The engagement is strengthening up, and we've moved away from that independent Pacific Island state type of brand. What you're detailing there seems to be a fundamental shift back to placing New Zealand as a lead nation in the Pacific. Do you see that being an advantage, perhaps, if New Zealand is positioning to be an independent broker on the Security Council, being a representative of the Pacific nations on such things?
Well, yes. So, I mean, I've got some direct experience in this area. I ran an aid program in the South Pacific for a couple of years when I was a junior diplomat and represented the Pacific in Washington, D.C. and in the Congress there. One of the reasons that the United States takes New Zealand seriously is because we are seen as an honest broker for the Southwest Pacific, and we lead a group of small island states along with Australia in international affairs. And, you know, frankly, for the most part, they're countries that have been too small for larger powers to be able to successfully engage with. Now, the world is changing. There are other powers who are busily running around the South Pacific with big checkbooks that, frankly, we can't compete with. And therefore, it is essential in strategic terms that our engagement with our Pacific neighbours is deepened and is of a quality which goes beyond just aid handouts. For example, the registered seasonal employer scheme for the annual season, horticulture and viticulture workers down from the islands has been, although not perfect, very, very successful and has deepened our relationship. For example, I believe it's now, or it has been, the second largest foreign exchange earner for the country of Vanuatu. Fascinating, eh? And because we've had good relationships built up between New Zealand employers and villages in the Pacific, those are kind of, they're almost family ties now, village ties, which others can't match. I would like to see us develop a Pacific broadcasting capability in the longer term as we can afford it. I said that on the campaign trail. One of the reasons for that is I think we need to be broadcasting in Pacific languages into the Pacific out of New Zealand. We have the world's largest Polynesian population. That's an asset for us, and it's our front yard. We need to ensure its security and its prosperity.
Okay, I'll just hand you, David, I'll hand you back to Bomber Bradbury. He's got a couple of other questions coming through here.
David, this week was the 5th year anniversary of the Lehman Brothers collapse, and Wall Street banks are back to mega profits. What do you think the meltdown of unregulated financial markets means for neoliberalism, and what lessons have we learned?
Well, one of the lessons we've learned, it's an excellent question, how long have you got, is that it shouldn't be the case that a dog could get a mortgage. You know, that might sound weird, but in the US, I believe that under the unregulated market system, there were cases of family pets being enrolled as mortgage holders, and people could get 120% of the value of their home in equity, so the house became an ATM. That was just dumb. And then, as we all know, the shonky debt that grew up around that, which was just ever over-leveraged, got blended with other debt in fancy stuff called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, and it then got magnified 100, sometimes 1,000 times until the world was awash in trillions of dollars of phony debt. And when the plug was pulled, it basically all collapsed. The consequence has been twofold. Firstly, that the majors, and in particular the US Federal Reserve, have had to do what John Key's been criticising the Green Party for, quantitative easing. Far from being the evil that the Prime Minister has suggested, and it's not Labour Party policy, but I'm just noting, when the US Federal Reserve started making noises they would slow it down, not even stop it, world stock markets went into a nosedive. in the last 12 months. So it can't be that bad if it's underpinned the recovery of world equity markets. It's not quite as easy as saying, well, New Zealand should do it too, because we don't have real interest rates that are close to zero at the moment, so we've got some headroom in that space. It's all, pretty pointy-headed stuff. But the second problem with the GFC response has been there hasn't been sufficient re-regulation yet, in my view, of global financial markets. Some of the worst examples have been outlawed. The G8 and the G20 group of countries are still working in that area, but considering that trillions of dollars of essentially public equity have been transferred into the private banking system, the quid pro quo has been a bit mushy.
Bob, have you got a supplementary there?
The financial economy in 1997, David, went from being 15 times greater than the real economy to 70 times greater than the real economy by 2007. How does the government compete with that kind of wealth inequality in a democratic sense?
So you think that's bad. What about the Kiwi dollar? Roughly 400 times as many Kiwi dollars are traded in any given year as are required to finance the trade and investment flows in and out of the country, the actual material foreign direct investment and trade flows. That's an enormous statistic, and it shows that the Kiwi dollar is basically a speculative plaything of international markets. Why is that? Well, because we have a really clean policy environment. No one ever gets pinged for trading the Kiwi dollar. And we've got a stable democratic country, even though it's run by John Key. And so it's easy money. It doesn't help us, though. It drives the New Zealand dollar up, as we've seen. That makes life harder for our exporters. They earn less, create less jobs, and our people are poorer. And we rack up a big international debt because our exchange rate runs amok at the behest of speculators. So guess what? We've got work to do. We sure as heck need a progressive government, because if we don't get one, this will just go on, and we'll amass more and more international debt. That would be a bad thing.
I'll just jump in very quickly with one quick question on that. When you're talking about all this currency trading, etc., do you see merits in a financial transaction tax?
Yes and no. That's a politician's answer. The desirability of an FTT is around the fact that if done well, there would be a very, very, very light impost which would act as a slight handbrake on some of those transactions. And as a reasonable response, it might be argued, to the need to raise revenue in a borderless and internet-enabled world. In fact, because of the migration to online channels, we're seeing a real erosion in the conventional tax base. So I'd almost go as far as to say that an FTT, at some point in the world's future, may be quite likely. Problem is that as a very small country, if we were to do it on our own, the giant sucking sound that you hear might be global capital leaving in a rush. And we probably don't want a capital strike in our financial markets. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. No. We've still got to invest and earn.
If you're looking domestically, the taxation, like you've said directly, you bet relating to readjusting progressive taxation in the upper areas. So are you seeing progressive taxation easing the reliance on consumer-based taxation, for example, like the GST, and ease back perhaps down toward the 10% if you're going to increase progressive taxation as a fundamental?
I hate to disappoint you, but no. I don't think we're going to be in a position to take GST down again, at least not until the capital gains tax is up to full running. And because we have to nominate a valuation date slightly in the future, it's going to be at least 5 years before those volumes build up. So maybe one day we can, but in the meantime we can't. In fact, to do all the social investment and economic investment that we're planning, we're going to be stretched pretty thin on the Crown balance sheet. So we don't have a couple of billion to spare by chucking GST down, sadly. I'd love to. But we do recognise that GST is a bit regressive, yes, because poor people spend all they earn and rich people don't. So relative to their income, they incur a higher share of GST. And that's why we have to maintain working for families and ensure that there is a strong social wage through the provision of free health, education and other services.
Bomber Bradbury's going to probably deploy all of his hits on me for scalping his questions here, but relating to working for families, do you see it as a mechanism of distributing some of that wealth back down into those that are really struggling at the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum?
Sure do, that's why we're doing it.
The criticisms are clearly that there's too much up the top end.
Is there potential to fine-tune WFF? Yes, there is. Am I going to name numbers or be specific right now? No, because it's really important that leaders don't make policy on the hoof. We've got a joined-up Labour Party policy process, I'm sure, looking at the effectiveness of working for families as part of it. What I would go so far as to indicate is that we're still thinking pretty hard about delivering for our poorest children and looking at a range of options to deliver higher levels of support right into the poorest families, even without working. So you'll hear more about that from us near the election.
Sure. Bomber, I'll put it back to you with the question there, and then I'll come back, David, on GCSB.
By the way, I should have said...
today, David, is Universal Suffrage Day, where women fought long, hard and courageously for the right to vote, yet 120 years later, women are still having to fight for access to abortion, equal pay rates, a culture of massive hidden and underreported sexual abuse, career glass ceilings, and solo mothers being forced to take jobs and their daughters pressured into long-term contraception. Why are women second-class citizens in their own country?
Oh, that's a hard one, because blokes put them there, I guess, and progress is slow. Just in parentheses, it's kind of ironic that one of my 2-year-olds, Sept, was the guy who brought in universal suffrage, but he actually didn't mean to. He got outsmarted in a parliamentary debate. So let's hope we can even the historical scores and do a little better. I'm a strong supporter of pay equity, and Labor is going to be bringing in a suite of policies that empower women, and not just in the traditional roles of child rearing and child care, but while we're on the subject, we sure as heck want to extend paid parental leave, restore the ECE subsidies. We want it to be the case that every Kiwi kid gets a good preschool education, and at the moment 95% of Pākehā kids do, something like 60% only of Māori and Pacifica kids do. So we really, really want to get into those communities. But look, we all know that sexism is ingrained. My partner is a woman lawyer. She's had to fight discrimination in the workplace for years, and I'm happy to say I'm married to a strong feminist. I've watched those struggles up close, and I want us to do everything we can to assist women to find a just and equitable place in our society.
David, if we pick up on the GCSB issue, at the public meeting in the first one, if you like, in Mount Albert,
Yep.
You stood up, you were near the front, and you made a very strong, definitive position with respect to Labor on what you would do once Labor became government. Now, the Green Party, for example, is saying it would repeal and then have an inquiry. Do you see that there's merit in taking Labor into that position where Labor would repeal what has gone through the House and then have the inquiry?
Why would you do that? What would happen in the meantime?
Would it be rolled back to exactly where it was prior to a few weeks ago?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, it's not repealing the whole act then, it's only repealing the amendments.
The amendment, to be specific.
Possibly. I certainly don't think that in practicality there would be a whole lot of difference, because what I've said I'm committed to as a minimum is an immediate inquiry, and the repeal of the offending provisions of the Act and their replacement with something which protects civil liberties, rights and freedoms. And let me be a bit more specific about that. And this is just my own personal starting view. But it's not my view, just to put it on record, that New Zealand doesn't need to have defensive intelligence capabilities. It's probably not productive to go into the details of, but that is life as we know it. And so we need to be able to defend ourselves. What that doesn't mean is that there should be an ability for the New Zealand security agencies to do unwarranted surveillance on New Zealand citizens. And the conditions for obtaining a lawful warrant should be very, very tightly specified. Now, the weaknesses of the current legislation are that while prima facie, presumably with some exceptions, a warrant is required to do a domestic intercept on a citizen for the purposes of domestic security intelligence. The same warrant requirement, at least in the interpretation that I've seen, is not required if it's a matter of cyber security, quote unquote, or something to do with, quote, information infrastructure. And then in the bill you look down and you find, or the Act as it now is, what's the definition of information infrastructure? And in the fine print it includes the words all transmissions. So you don't need a warrant if it's a transmission. And if it's supposedly to do with cyber security, okay, that's fine. If you're wanting to do a domestic tap, then all you do is define it as a cyber security matter. Now, John Keys pledged that he would get a warrant. That's nice. But when asked to put that in the law, he said no. Well, you know, I can't help but not be fully trusting in that bloke. And there's a second issue, which, of course, is a bit more subtle, which is whether there is an opportunity for the agencies to circumvent warranting provisions by borrowing information off their partners. And I think we need to tighten up in that area as well.
Yeah. And very quickly, a lot of people kind of say, look, what the SIS and the GCSB are doing, if there's an issue that is a problem with a particular group or people or a person here in New Zealand, surely if there was concerns that's an issue of criminality. Why are the police not handling that? Do you see that there's merit in that argument?
Partially and usually. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there could be a security issue arise with highly evidenced probable cause, which is not a domestic criminal matter. Right. So if there's a New Zealand citizen is involved in some form of espionage activity, which has not yet resulted in a crime being committed, but which might in future result in a crime such as a terrorist act or a theft or an invasion of privacy. If that, and such an invasion may or may not be criminal, of course, but I think we have to be a little bit more sophisticated. But hey, look, now we're getting down to a level of specificity in drafting that I'm not currently fully briefed on, and I don't really think it's appropriate for me to delve down too much. Our broad principles are clear, which is we believe New Zealanders have a right to privacy, they have a right to freedom of expression and association. The key government is undermining that at every turn. That's been independently verified by folks like the Human Rights Commission, who the Prime Minister then threatened to cut the funding of. We will repeal the offending provisions of the Act, we will repeal the bill and replace it with something more appropriate. We can't go into that blind. We think we need an immediate inquiry. I actually think it's a bit cart before the horse to repeal before you run the inquiry, because you really need to know what you're changing.
Right.
Not changing from, but changing to.
I'll pass back to Bomber Bradbury for his questions.
My final questions to you tonight, David, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. With the Pacific becoming the new Cold War friction point between China and America, the US see the TPPA as a national security issue. How does New Zealand balance Chinese and American interests?
I think that question is at two layers, and I think it's one of the great questions of our time. The first layer is how do we have a foreign policy which appropriately balances our interests in respect of the Western and Eastern hemispheres, and within that, what approach should we take to the TPPA? Look, greater minds than ours will debate these questions for many years to come, but in my personal view, while being a good friend of both the US and the People's Republic of China, I believe that what's in New Zealand's interests is to have an independent foreign policy which respects both, which is on friendly and good terms with both, which trades successfully with both, but which does not lock itself into one or the other. That is why we are not a member of the ANZUS Alliance, but we are a very, very good friend of the US, as we are very friendly with the People's Republic. Dropping down to the TPPA, this is probably the most complex international trade, and it's not just a trade agreement, it's partly a strategic agreement, it's partly an agreement which has a domestic economic implication, and I do not believe that it is that there has yet been a mature public debate, because the government will not release any details on where it's got to in the negotiations. So one of our senior diplomats is off at the moment in the final round. The argument they run is, well, we're still negotiating, we shouldn't be flowing a text around. Well, maybe in detail, at some level of detail, that's true, but if you want to build a public conversation around something which so fundamentally affects our sovereignty, then that better start pretty soon. And this is going to be a very difficult one, because we're going to have to balance off our trade interests, and the upside for us is market access for our products, both primary and intellectual property, with the fact that we don't want to see our Pharmac disestablished, that we don't want to see IP rules which are inimical to our small companies, and really, really importantly, we don't want investor-state relations obligations such that we are going to be sued by companies many times larger than New Zealand. So, for example, Mobil has a GDP or a turnover far larger than this country, much deeper pockets. And we have to have a democratic sovereignty which is not constrained by the threat of suit by a private company. So I'm really, really leery about the investor-state relations chapter. I don't want to see New Zealand locked out of a good strategic arrangement with a broad base of democratic countries. There are arguments to recommend engagement in that way, but New Zealanders need the opportunity to debate these things, and they need some of the facts on the table in order to do it.
Thanks for that, David. And just the last question here. Clearly, amongst the centre-left fraternities all around the country, and many other kind of axes, if we want to label people in that way, there's an excitement over your leadership, your successful leadership campaign here. There's also a mood around that we've been picking up on the left blogs and the centre-left blogs, where there are those who are sceptical, and it's almost a group who are saying there was the Great Betrayal in 1984 to 1990, and there are those that were around that were impassioned about the Ahmed Zawi case, for example, in the 2000s. What do you say to those people about where you are going to take Labour from here on?
Firstly, that I was the minister that let Ahmed Zawi become a free citizen. Secondly, that I was the guy who turned down a job at the Treasury because I disagreed with Rogernomics in 1989, and I haven't changed my view since then. 1987 when I first graduated, and I got a job offer from them. I wasn't going to be part of a Rogenome brotherhood, and I didn't join the Labour Party to do that either. Now, I don't blame people when there's a new leadership, a new administration saying, gee, I wonder if they'll be good to their word. That's a fair question to ask. And all I would ask in return is that people give us the opportunity. If I look a little tired tonight, that is because I'm working till the small hours every day to do a full makeover of our caucus lineup in 1 week, as well as a significant look at our internal system structures and staffing. That's a pretty good first week on the job. And unless we get those mechanics right, we can't deliver for our people. So don't prejudge, folks. Judge us by our actions. Somebody asked me yesterday, are you going to do all those things you said on the campaign trail? And the answer is, you bet.
It sounds like the key line of the David Cunliffe campaign, you bet. Bomber Bradbury, do you want to just pass off at the end?
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, David. Good luck for the job.
All right, thanks, mate.
And congratulations, David, and thank you for coming on to the Daily Blog and doing this session here. No doubt we'll get flasher at it.
Yeah, and I'll try and keep my answers shorter next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, David. Bye-bye.